So joining us now is former U.S. Ambassador to Russia and NBC News International Affairs analyst Michael McFaul. Hi, Ambassador.
Hi. Good to see you in
Great
person.
to have you in studio.
Yeah, fun
you
to
are
be
the
here.
man of the day, the weekend, the hour amidst what is ongoing in Alaska right now. This unprecedented moment in which we're seeing Russian President Vladimir Putin on U.S. soil.
Yes.
Which is amazing in and of itself. And I wonder if, as you're viewing this meeting, if you're thinking what I'm thinking, which is he has already won in securing this meeting and stepping on U.S. soil.
Yeah, I agree. That is right. What happens afterwards is kind of secondary for him personally. I mean, he's meeting with the President of the United States, the most powerful person in the world. Most leaders in the world of democratic countries won't meet with Putin. Added to that, as a sweetener, he gets to meet in the United States. He's an indicted war criminal. Let's all remember that. And yet he's meeting with the president. And then Alaska, to add just even one more dimension, that's part of the former Russian Empire. And if you watch the Russian TV folks, I do, so you don't have to.
Thank you for that.
They're all making a lot of this. Like, this is symbolically, they talk about, well, maybe that was a bad deal for us back then. Maybe we should reconsider that.
Wow.
So there's all this kind of imperial talk piled onto it. But the biggest point is the one you said. It's already a victory for him. I hope, therefore, Trump has something in mind that brings a victory for us, the Americans, and our European allies and the Ukrainians.
Well, isn't that ironic, though, what you're talking about when it comes to Russian television? Because this whole conversation is how are they going to come to a ceasefire? And it seems as if they're leaning in the direction of possibly swapping and or ceding Ukrainian territory, right? And if, in fact, that happens, what message is that sending to Russian President Vladimir Putin?
Well, first, it's very important for everybody to remember they're talking about swapping Ukrainian land for Ukrainian land, right? Not Russian land for Ukrainian land. And second, there's no Ukrainian in the room to do that deal. So I think it's very important that President Trump does not go down that rabbit hole of start talking about this village for that village. It's not his land. He's not the president of Ukraine. The people of Ukraine needed to make that decision through their democratically elected leaders, including their democratically elected president. But second, the very fact that they're beginning to talk about that's another victory for Putin. Remember, he invaded. He started this whole thing. There was no threat. And any talk of swapping of land rewards imperialism. It rewards war. And I think that's horrible, obviously, for Ukraine, but I think it's bad for international security around the world. We fought World War II in part to end annexation and to end imperialism. Those two things ended in 1945, and there were pockets of wars where land has changed and borders has changed, but not very much. This could really open up this Pandora's box to say, okay, might makes right. It's okay to change borders through the use of force.
What incentive does Putin have at this point to end this war? I mean, if this was happening arguably 6 months ago, he may have had more incentive because he was kind of on his heels, right? The Ukrainian military was doing a better job at that point in defending itself. But now Russia has made significant gains into Ukraine. What incentive does he have to stop?
Honestly, I think very little. I mean, I hope I'm wrong. I hope there'll be some breakthrough later today and that he'll sit down with Zelenskyy to end this just barbaric, horrific war. A war, by the way, that includes every single day killing of Ukrainian civilians with Russian drones and Russian rockets. But analytically, that's what I hope. What I see is that Putin thinks that momentum is on his side. They are making incremental gains at tremendous loss of life of Russian soldiers, but he doesn't care about that. But the biggest thing why he thinks time is on his side is because we, the United States, are abandoning Ukraine right now. President Trump isn't talking about a new military assistance package. He's happy to let Ukrainians buy our weapons. Think about that. We're now profiting off of the war in Ukraine. But he's basically signaling, well, we're pulling back. That's a different position than President Biden has. And therefore, if you're Putin, you think time is on your side. Eventually, they'll be able to wear down the Ukrainians and capture the territory that remember, he has already had these big formal ceremonies where he already has annexed these 4 regions in the eastern part of Ukraine that he still does not control. I don't see him stopping until he finally gets all 4 of those territories.
You know, President Trump for a long time had praised Russian President Vladimir Putin. They were friends. He considered him a friend. He said it publicly and
many
privately.
Times, right?
Many times. It's only over the last few months in which he has begun to call Putin on his bluff, right? Saying that he doesn't necessarily trust him. I think at one point he said he's getting BS from Vladimir Putin.
Yeah.
This is something that everybody from the war hawk John Bolton was telling him in his first term to you on television. I mean, most of the international community was saying, do not trust the Russian president.
Right.
And now he is hearing that and heeding that. The question is whether or not he's going to take that into this meeting and walk out of that meeting feeling that as well, right?
Yeah.
Because I think it's important for you to remind people who Vladimir Putin is. He's a former KGB agent. This guy knows how to negotiate and knows how to manipulate.
Yes.
So what is he facing?
Well, I think he's facing a very tall order, President Trump is. Vladimir Putin, they joke about it in Russia. You're never a former KGB agent. You're always a KGB agent. They have this loyalty, this brotherhood that they call it. Number 2, he's been doing this for 25 years, right? He started with President Clinton. He's been through many presidents. Number 3, I've been in the room with him, with President Obama, and Vice President Biden when I worked in the Obama administration. And he is a formidable interlocutor in that he knows his facts. He comes really well prepared. And he's quite determined. He's quite persistent to keep making the points that he wants. And in this particular meeting, as we just discussed, he's in no hurry to make a deal. Trump has created all the pressure for a deal by talking about he wants to be the peacemaker and win the Nobel Peace Prize. Putin doesn't face any of that pressure. And so what the president needs to be aware of is that asymmetry of information and experience. President Trump doesn't know the name of all the villages that are being fought about right now. President Trump doesn't know the 1,000-year history. Of course, Putin has his special, his stylized facts. Yeah,
right.
But Trump doesn't know enough to refute it.
He has his alternative facts to history.
His alternative facts, distorted facts. It's very distorted. But President Trump doesn't know that history well enough to refute it. And the last thing I would say is, I hope, it's on the schedule for a one-on-one meeting. Those are always dangerous, no matter who's the president. We didn't like him when I worked for President Obama at the White House. We always wanted somebody in the room. It was usually me, by the way, because I know something about Russia. I speak Russian. I could help the president if he ever got jammed. You never want your principal, as we call them, right? Either the Secretary of State or the president, one-on-one with Putin, because the President Trump has 1,000 issues he's thinking about. Putin has one main issue he's thinking about. That's Ukraine.
Right.
That creates a real asymmetry there.
But the thing is, Putin also knows that Trump wants to walk away from this thing looking like he won.
Exactly.
Looking like he negotiated, right?
Yes.
And he knows what Trump likes to win in which way, and that is via money, via profiting, right?
Yep.
And so there is this potential possibly that Putin could say, hey, let's make a mineral deal.
Yep.
Right? Without necessarily negotiating a ceasefire.
Yep.
Are you worried about that?
Very. And if you look at the composition of the Russian delegation, they're all people I know. Their economics people are coming. The head of the Russian investment fund, Kirill Dmitriev is his name, he's there.
Oh, wow.
That's so bizarre.
Why would you need him there for this?
He was never at any. Worked in the government for 5 years. He was never at any summit meeting. He is there. And I know this gentleman because I worked in Moscow. He's super savvy. He's got degrees from Harvard and Stanford. He speaks in business-like terms. And there's no question in my mind that they're trying to make this a meeting that's bigger than Ukraine and really is about U.S.-Russia relations and U.S.-Russia economic relations, precisely because they're following the strategy you talked about. They think that that will appeal to President Trump, and they may be right.
Ambassador, none of us have ever been inside the room of a president and a Russian president during high-stakes negotiations. Can you take me behind the scenes for a moment? The play-by-play. What is it like to be sitting there? What are his mannerisms? Who is oftentimes next to him? How does that conversation go?
So the first thing to watch for is, will he be late?
Is he often late?
He's notoriously late.
Okay.
The lower level you are, the later you are. He was once 3 hours late for Secretary Kerry.
Wow. Okay.
3 hours.
So that's low level to him, Secretary of State.
Yes.
Okay.
When he met with President Obama in Los Cabos in 2012, I was there for that meeting. He was 45 minutes late for a meeting with the President of the United States of America. So that's a game he plays. Second, he talks a lot. He'll stare at you, by the way. Somehow he doesn't seem to ever blink, and he'll stare intensely and go into these long historical things. His first meeting with President Obama in 2009, I was at that as well in Moscow. He spoke for 58 minutes before the president spoke, President Obama. And I know because I was a note taker, so I was marking the time.
He just spoke for 58 minutes straight.
Without interruption. Now,
with a translator.
With a translator, with translators on both sides. By the way, Lavrov was like correcting our translator in this incredibly annoying way, the foreign minister. He's a very annoying character. He'll be there too. And then the third thing I would say about his style is he doesn't ever feel the need to cut a deal. I would say this is a Russian negotiating style in general. We Americans, we tend to be in a hurry, right? We tend to be, I used to think about it like we're engineers. Like we have a problem, we need to solve it.
Right.
That's a very American way to think about it. Putin doesn't think in those terms. He doesn't need to solve the problem in Ukraine. He could fight for years. And that gives him an advantage in that he never has to be hurried to agree. Having said all that, he also wants to keep Trump on his side. He had that relationship with him in the first term. He doesn't want to completely alienate him. So I wouldn't be surprised if there was some concessions or something out of the blue, some other issue where Putin starts a cooperative track, maybe on arms control, right, that we're not even thinking about. Because I do think he understands that for his rehabilitation in the world, Trump is his ally.
Does he shake hands? Does he drink water? Does he smoke cigarettes? Anything?
He shakes hands. He doesn't like photo ops when they're standing because he's not a very tall man.
How tall is he?
I think he's 5'6" or so.
Okay.
I just remember that from the
President
first.
Trump is 6'3",
He's
believe.
a big guy.
6'4".
And so in our meeting with President Obama, also a tall man, they didn't want the cameras to come in until they were sitting down. I do remember that. So he's quite sensitive about his height. And he also is, he sounds like a guy that's, just all these grievances, right, about how the West did Russia wrong, right? The collapse of the Soviet Union, we did that. By the way, the foreign minister, Lavrov, who I used to deal with, he walked in a sweatshirt to his hotel in Anchorage with a sweatshirt with the initials of the Soviet Union. USSR. Talk about trolling us, right? Like this is who we were. This is a great power. Like they do little things like that on purpose.
Which speaks to also the fear of these European leaders in this, Zoom call the other day.
Yes.
With Zelenskyy as well, saying to President Trump, listen, don't do anything.
Yes.
Until you talk to us.
Right. And I hope that President Trump listened to them closely. He said he's not going to do anything, and that would be wise. But he might be tempted. When you get close to a deal, you get tempted. And President Trump, of course, thinks of himself as the great deal maker. He wrote a book about it. He's always talking about all the great deals he's doing, and Putin knows that. The other thing I would say about Putin, in his preparation, it's not just about talking points about Ukraine. He's done his homework. Well, for Trump, he's done his homework for a long, long time. He knows lots of details about how people think. Remember, not only was he a KGB officer, he recruited people, right? And so there's this whole psychological thing that goes with that. And I've seen him, in meetings where he obviously studied the personalities of the people he's doing. So he knows that Trump is eager for a deal, and he might just give him enough to trap him to say something that then later might constrain President Zelenskyy.
So Ukraine and Russia have both, you have to give it to them, have been consistent about what they want from this war throughout this entire time. It's the U.S. that hasn't been consistent.
Right.
What does Ukraine want, and what does Russia ultimately want?
Well, Russia wants the territories that he already annexed. So that's 4 regions of Russia in addition to Crimea. That's the new map. You buy a map in Russia today, those are already part of the Russian Federation. Second, he wants a government in Ukraine that is subservient to Moscow, and that means not President Zelenskyy. Third, he wants no NATO membership for Ukraine. And fourth, he wants to control the number of soldiers they have and the weapons that they get. He just wants Ukraine to be weak. That's what he's trying to achieve. Ukraine, President Zelenskyy, of course, politically, he continues to say, because he has to, we want to restore our 1991 borders. That means those 4 regions in the east plus Crimea. When I talk to Ukrainians, which I do almost every day, including people close to the president, I think they understand that is not going to be achievable anytime soon. And the essence of a deal could be the following. Zelenskyy could agree to reunify his country only through peaceful means, right? So that means de facto the territories that are being held, he's not going to try to liberate through military force. But in return for that, this phrase land for peace, they need to know that the peace is guaranteed. Just giving land without peace is no good for them. And they already did that in 2014. Right. They lost land. It didn't lead to peace. It led to a continued low-level war and eventually this full-scale invasion in 2022. So what he needs from us, from the West, is security guarantees. And the best way to do it is membership into NATO. That will freeze the borders. Russia and the Soviet Union, they've never attacked a NATO country. I don't think they ever will. By the way, NATO's never attacked the Soviet Union or Russia. So if you want to freeze that border, that's the way you could do it. Kind of like what happened eventually in Germany, West Germany, member of NATO, East Germany, a member of the Soviet bloc, and it froze it for many decades. But tragically, that peace is not being talked about right now. President Trump...
And it seems like it's a non-negotiable with Putin.
But Putin doesn't get to negotiate who's in NATO. That's the point. To me, that's the beauty of it. You could have
But for him to relent, it is a non-negotiable.
But here's how it could work. I've thought about this. You have an armistice.
I'm sure you have.
You have an armistice, right? You have an armistice, right? You have the trumpets blaring, the war's over. That is Putin's greatest day of his life. He becomes one of the czars, one of the Russian leaders that expanded the Russian Empire, right? Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, Putin the Great. That's his greatest day ever when that happens. The next day, NATO meets and says, Ukraine's now a member of NATO. That's not the day that Putin's going to invade Ukraine again.
Right.
There's no way. He's not going to do that. He knows. I was in the meeting with him for 5 years. NATO expansion was never an issue when I was in the government because he knows that there's not a threat from NATO to the Russian Federation. He'll say it 1,000 times, but he knows we're not going to attack them, let alone use Ukraine to attack them. So I think that would be the big deal. That would be something that the Ukrainian people would be better off with, and the Russians. But I want to be realistic. That's my deal. That's not what Trump is going to be offering today.
I know we got to wrap because I know you have a busy day ahead. I have 2 more questions for you. There are reports that this could be a one-on-one, not unlike Helsinki, right? I believe it was in Helsinki.
Yes.
In which literally they were there alone. So
yes.
The worry there was even if they said something happened, no one can actually believe that it happened.
Right.
So there's no accountability. And or the possibility that Secretary of State Marco Rubio and then Foreign Minister Lavrov would be in the room as well. along with translators. And it seems as if definitely they will both have their own translators instead of sharing a translator.
Correct.
Right? How does that kind of change the composition of this meeting if, in fact, you have the Rubios and the Lavrovs in the room versus on their own?
Well, Helsinki went down in history as the worst summit between Moscow and Washington. I'm using that on purpose because sometimes it was Soviet Union, sometimes it was Russia, ever. And what happened is he kicked all of his people out of the room. He kicked out the person that had my job when I worked at the White House. Her name was Fiona Hill. She was dismissed from the room. And that's when Putin explained to Trump that we didn't interfere in your election. That, all that stuff they've been telling you, Mr. President, is not true. And then he went out and told the whole world that. And it wasn't just a bad summit for U.S.-Russian relations. It was a bad summit for President Trump. He looked like a fool in the eyes of the entire world. There was a sidebar, by the way, where he also agreed to hand over some Americans to be interrogated in that one-on-one meeting, and I was one of them. So that was big news for me because he didn't understand that it's called an MLAT treaty, this very obscure treaty, but that's a small part of the issue. I just hope that they'll study that and not do that again because and have people like Rubio and Lavrov in the room. Because the other thing to remember, translators are not note takers. They can't do that. I've worked with our translators. That's not their job. And you're exactly right. In those one-on-one meetings, if nobody else is there to take notes, then there can be disagreements about what was agreed to. I think that's what happened when the special envoy Witkoff was in Moscow last week.
Right.
I actually think there was a garble there. I think he came back and reported something different than what Putin had said, and that you don't want that to happen with the President of the United States.
You need a couples therapist in the room to say, what did you hear the President say?
Always useful. Always useful.
So how does a meeting like this come to be? And what goes on inside the White House in preparing to meet with the Russian president?
So when I worked at the White House, I prepared two summits. One in Moscow in 2009 and one in the United States in 2010 in Washington. And compared to those, there's a couple things that are very different here. Number one, usually you negotiate, we call them in the State Department deliverables for a summit, and lower level officials negotiate those agreements before the presidents meet, right? So one of the big ones we did, for instance, was the New START Treaty, where we reduced by 30% the number of nuclear weapons in the world. That's a deliverable. That's a big deal. That's a big treaty. And then Obama and then President Medvedev, not Putin, met in Prague to sign that deal. They didn't negotiate it in Prague.
Got it.
This is the reversal, right? Nothing's been agreed to, and yet the presidents are getting together. That's very different. Second, the preparation of just the even small details of the meetings that I was in charge took months to prepare. This meeting was agreed to last week. And it sounds like from the reporting, it was Putin that wanted the meeting and Trump just said yes. And I also think that's another mistake. One of the most valuable things you have as a White House official, I worked at the National Security Council, is presidential time. We would use the president's time to get all kinds of things that we thought were in the interests of our national security, right? In this instance, they just gave away that very precious commodity that they have, presidential time, and then added a meeting in the United States for nothing pre-agreed in return. And I hope maybe they did and it's been secret, we don't know, but that is very unusual. Usually there's something agreed to. At multilateral summits, for instance, we call them party gifts. What is the president of Ukraine bringing for his party gift to the nuclear security summit? Because if you're not bringing a gift, you don't get a meeting with the president. Because
the presidential time is essentially in and of itself part of the negotiation.
Exactly. Absolutely. The photo op of Trump and Putin today is a fantastic gift to this pariah, to this indicted criminal, the leader, the imperial dictator of Russia. All the words I'm using are not the words that President Trump is going to be using. That's a giant gift. I want to know, what is Trump getting in return?
Should Zelenskyy be at this meeting? Do you think it would have been helpful had he been there?
Yes, I do. And I hope that could be one of the positive outcomes of the meeting, that at least they agree to have that trilateral meeting in the future.
Ambassador Michael McFaul, we are very thankful for you today.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it, sir.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.